Here we go. So I would appreciate those of you who are not on camera. I would appreciate it if you would be on camera, because otherwise you're hiding. And that's sort of how I look at it. Of course, it's your choice, but why not? You know, we'll have a lot more fun if I can see you. So anyway, I did want to thank Andrea Doolin of UNC Advance, Jill Huerta, and Ara Young for the Center for Graduate Life for inviting me here today. I'm very excited to talk about this topic. I've written about it, I've published articles about it, and I'm certainly not the only one. In fact, if you go back a ways, Albert Einstein, if you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it well enough. And then others, I think, sort of took that from him. But for any of you who might be in physics, Richard Feynman, of course, if you can't explain it to a first-year student, which I think is great, because I think that's a good place for you to keep in mind about some of the audience. So there's really a long history of scientists wanting to be able to communicate what's important to the public. Let me just take you through a little situation. So let's say I go to the doctor, and this is what the doctor tells me about a prescription he's given me. So I'm sitting there going, I have no idea. Do you know what autumnid means? Or do you know what ataxic means? Do you know what emesis means? I didn't. So then I asked the doctor to explain it to me in a way he thought that I could understand. So then he says this. And I'm still going, okay, I'm starting to get the idea that maybe this medication is not such a good thing, but could you put it in plain language? And he said, all right, here's what it is. Now, the amount of time it took me to understand number 3 was probably 10% of the time it could possibly take me to understand number 1, because I'd have to ask him what all those words mean, right? So I also was at an optometrist or ophthalmologist not too long ago, and the technician said, how is your vision when your eyes are in a superior position? And I said, well, if they were superior, I wouldn't be here in the office. But then I said, what do you mean a superior position? She said, you know, when you're looking up. And I said, well, it would probably be really helpful if that's what you said. If you're talking to other physicians, other eye specialists, other nurses, of course, superior position has meaning, but literally it had no meaning to me. And I doubt that it would have had meaning to most of you either. So what is our agenda? So I'm going to talk just a little bit about the problems that come with science when people don't understand the science that is trying to be expressed or explained. We'll talk about the definition of plain language, and the definition was created through an international group. We'll talk about plain language strategies. I don't have time today for you to do exercises for all the strategies, nor do I have time to explain them all. So I picked out those that I thought were most important. And then finally, you'll get the slides. And at the end, there's a whole series of resources that I think can help you much more as you move towards learning how to make your scientific research understandable to a variety of audiences, some of whom are well educated, but experts in one field are not experts in another. So here we go. So problem number 1 has to do with trust. The higher the levels of familiarity with the work of scientists, those are associated with more positive and more trusting views of science regarding your competence, your credibility, and your commitment to the public. That is, when I noticed this in the beginning of COVID, when the CDC and others got on television to explain the pandemic, they were using words that I don't understand. I have a PhD. That didn't help me understand a lot of the medical terms. And so I, of course, trust what science says, but there are a lot of people who don't, and possibly because information is not explained to them in a way they can understand. The second problem is that most of you are not going to stay in academia. Most of you are going to go out into the job market. Your ability to explain clearly what you do in lay terms may actually be what gets you the job. Because if, let's say a lab was Abbott Labs, for instance, if they were having to decide between two candidates and one could show that they could both speak and write so that lay people could understand it, that would give you an edge. And then finally, problem number 3 is that there was a study done that I rely on constantly, in which scientific information was explained simply, then complex, with more and more complexity. And the third level of complexity and the second level of complexity, the readers who were doctoral candidates at Princeton lost respect for the writer, lost respect for the institution and for the writer who produced the information in a manner that they themselves could not understand. So there are ramifications to the inability for scientists and others to learn to, who don't use plain language. So what exactly is it? There's an International Plain Language Federation made up of people from 20 countries around the world. And this is the definition that they determined would fit the needs, regardless of what language it was translated into. So it's critical with plain language that the wording, the structure, and the design have to be clear. So in other words, formatting matters. When you write for a lay audience, when you're writing a grant proposal, for instance, even things like the headings that you're using, or listing information, or using tables. So the formatting and the design is also important. So then that the intended audience can easily find what they need. All of us want to get in, get it, and get out, understand what they find, and then use that information to fulfill whatever need or goal they have. In addition, in plain language, the way I like to think of them, that your information should be clear, should be concise, and should be credible. So let me show you an example. So, well, I'm sorry. I'm going to give you one more slide and then we'll show you some examples. I did some research for this presentation today and discovered that there's a new genre of writing called plain language summaries, which are given at the beginning like an abstract, but in plain language, that then allows a wider audience to understand the academic paper that you've written. And so with these plain language summaries, it allows your audience to expand beyond those who are already experts or know about the topic. And in another instance, a well-written proposal. So when you're writing a grant proposal, with which many of you are likely to be doing, or you will be providing the writer with the information about the research that is being done, to be written for readers who may be scientists, but may not be familiar with that particular article or your particular researcher. So I could have been a dentist and still not understand what it meant to put my eyes in a superior position, even though I'm in the field of medicine. And a well-written proposal is written to communicate with all the reviewers, not just with those who have expertise. Real quickly, I also discovered that 60+ academic journals now require these plain language summaries. So when you submit an article to one of the 60 academic journals, they will ask you for a plain language summary. And frankly, this surprised me because I didn't realize that so many academic journals had gone down that road. So I'm very pleased about that, of course. So now let's start taking a look at some examples. So take a look at one on the left side. And let me tell you the words I don't understand. Okay. Now, granted, my PhD is in English, but nevertheless, I know what a bacteria is. I know what secrete. I don't know what enzyme beta lactamase. I have no idea what that is. I do know, of course, penicillin resistance. So now I'm getting the idea that there's a certain bacteria that is resistant to penicillin and cephalosporin, but I don't care about that word. I just go right to antibiotics. Then the TEM, I have no idea what that stands for. Isoform, substrate, specificity, hypersensitivity, almost every other word in here is one that I don't understand. So I don't think this would count as a plain language summary, but let's look at this one instead. So let's say that what we have now is the spread of antibiotic resistance is a global threat. It's the leading cause, or the leading cause of that resistance is an enzyme released by bacteria. And notice that they use plain language first, an enzyme released by bacteria, and then they gave the scientific name, very appropriate order to do. You give people the familiar and then you give them the unfamiliar. Then they can go on and use that unfamiliar term. It resists antibiotics, et cetera, et cetera. And also notice at the very end, the sentence rapid mutation allows it to quickly acquire resistance at a faster rate. That's a really important conclusion. But where is it in the original paragraph? Under hypersensitivity of beta lactamase, it's in the middle of the paragraph. So plain language is not only an issue about the language that you use, but also where are you going to put the most important ideas? And that is where the reader would expect to find them. And once you have replaced all of that jargon or defined the jargon on the right side, then you can make your material even more accessible. So there's a myth I hear occasionally. My husband, who I still like after 32 years of marriage, will say, well, you know, are you going to work on that project? Are you going to kind of dumb it down? And of course, that just makes me crazy, because writing in plain language is not dumbing down, it's wising up. In other words, if you are giving me information that I need to make a decision about you or your research, putting it in language I understand is not dumbing it down. It is understanding and appreciate what your audience needs to know. And I always like to say, no lay person ever complained that scientific information was too easy to understand. And partly this comes from the myth of professionalism. I was an academic. I wrote all of these articles using language that you probably wouldn't have understood because I was talking to my peers. When it came time for me, when I left the university and started my own business, I still write about the same topics, but I don't write about it using hegemony, the word hegemony, every other sentence, which is what a lot of colleagues do, because I realized that I was no longer talking to academics. So your academic credentials are not under scrutiny. People will not think that there's something wrong with you because you have made something simple. Once you leave academia, you will be in situations where writing, as I said earlier, writing clearly will greatly improve the path that you go down. So what are some of these strategies? As I mentioned, we won't have time to go over all of them. I'm going to talk a little about audience, purpose, and context, because that kind of gives you the big picture. And also because you really want to be writing from what does the audience need to know as opposed to what do I want to tell them. One of the problems with being an expert is that you want to share your expertise with everybody. And frankly, most people don't want to know nearly what you know. And so part of what you do is, what is it that the audience needs to know as opposed to what do I want to tell them? We'll talk about short sentences and paragraphs. You'll do some exercises around jargon, using common words, being concise and active voice. And I'll reference the other information, the bulleted information here, but we won't have time to do exercises on all of it. So if you want to take away one thing from today, it's this slide. That research shows that the sentences that are most easily understood and remembered are those that are in the 15 to 18 word range with 25 words maximum. Paragraphs should be short because as people are reading, even when something is translated into plain language, but frankly, even if it isn't, even if you continue to write in an academic tone, long, complicated, hyphenated sentences, excuse me, put a strain on our memory and recall. So you want short sentences, short paragraphs, you want to use a lot of headings, and whenever possible, you want to use a visual to show your data, not paragraphs. So in other words, when you write for people, you want to explain the problem, explain what your research is going to do to solve the problem, and explain why the public should care, particularly if you're writing a grant. So what's the problem, what's the solution, and who cares? So things to think about. So let me ask you this sort of in the chat, and then Aura can read them, a few of them to me. Write in the chat who it is that you think you would be writing to that would require plain language. So just real quickly, jot down in the chat box, who do you anticipate your audience to be that would not be people like you?
So far we have city officials, policymakers, journalists, community stakeholders, certain healthcare providers.
Great, that's great. I hadn't thought about city folks. And then I realized one of you who sent me filled out the needs assessment, it works in traffic. And so, yes, of course. So here are things that you must first consider. Are those people experts in your field? No. Do they understand your vocabulary? They will not understand the common vocabulary that you use when you speak to others in your field. What do they likely already know? In other words, is your research a follow-up to something that you know that they have already written or become familiar with? Because that will help determine how much information you need to tell them or write to them. What are their concerns? Remember, what is the problem? How are you going to solve it? And why is that important? What questions would they have? So in other words, whether it's a grant committee or prospective clients or letters of application, what are the questions they might have about your research? So real quickly, if I were going to get a passport and somebody said to me, well, what do you need to know about getting a passport? I might say, well, how long does it last? Where's the link to go? What's it going to cost me? Do I have to have it for my children? In other words, I would generate a list of questions that I think my audience is going to want to know. And then from there, I can create something that fits their needs. So the other thing about writing for non-expert audiences is something that I think we all get tired of. And if you just think about it in your own life, when you have gotten information that was bureaucratic, opaque, confusing, certainly did not sound human, what was your emotional reaction? And I know the authoritative and unemotional way that scientists are taught to write for journal articles is not appropriate when communicating with a general audience. The general audience wants information to be conversational, to be helpful, to be friendly, to be empathetic, to at least show that there's a human being on the other side of it. So for example, one of the strategies that we won't get to today is the use of pronouns, referring to yourself as I or the scientists or we, and referring to your readers or your audience as you, etc. in many contexts would be perfectly appropriate. So let's take a look. This is a great example someone who may be on the call today sent to me. And my apologies, because I think it was for a fellowship or perhaps an application for admission. I don't really know the context. But notice as you read through this, she's explaining what her research is. She's explaining why it's important, clinically significant. She explains who her population is, and then right there in the middle of it, she says, this year, the pastor at my childhood church died because of a massive heart attack in his early 50s, and my cousin died suddenly from suffering a massive stroke at the age of 47. Then she goes on back into the plain language explanation. But that sentence showed me something about this researcher, that she had an emotional, I'll say, attachment or an emotional reason why this research meant so much to her. And that little bit of empathy that she put in there, that tiny bit of storytelling, all of a sudden makes this information feel more human, and feel that it has benefits to it, and this is why it mattered to her. So aside from audience, then we have to think about purpose. So again, in the chat, thank you for doing that last time so quickly, put down what purposes you might have for writing in plain language. What are the reasons or the purposes for writing for the public?
Outreach to families, share relevant information, share research, awareness for people in traffic, funding applications, to inform about a publicly relevant problem.
Great. Those are great. Those are great. So if you take your audience and then you take your purpose, and if the purpose and the audience are going to drive what you say and how you say it. And then the last element in that is the context. So I'm just going to show you a situation I was in, and I think you'll empathize with my situation here. So I'm driving down from, I don't know, the mountains somewhere in North Carolina, and I come to a stoplight, which at the moment that I got there was green, and this is what I saw. Now, in that context, my ability to decide which road I'm supposed to take, let's say I was looking for 29 South. Well, I've got 29 South that goes that way and 29 South that goes this way. So likely this was at an intersection, right? However, this is the way the signs appeared. So the context is they're expecting me to read it and understand it while I'm driving my car and not necessarily at a red light. So it's very helpful to understand. We'll go back to the traffic thing. Has there just been recently, or in the past year, an accident that was caused by a maybe a malformance in traffic patterns, for example? Is there a crisis behind it? Is there a situation that is causing this research to be pushed forward the way COVID research was pushed forward by so many research companies at the time of the pandemic began? So that context can be very important. So now, and then I'll show you a couple examples, and then you'll get to do some exercises. And notice I say get to do. So this will be more of the fun part. So jargon. So jargon is specialized terminology that those outside your field may not understand. I said earlier, experts in one field are not experts in the other. And I always say this, that speaking Greek doesn't mean you can understand Spanish. So if we were, and technical jargon is different from business jargon. And I think I have a slide about business jargon, which really is complicating information for no particular reason other than it's just the habit. So in this case, this technology will help doctors build capacity to provide. So what does that really mean? It's going to help them provide rather than build capacity to. So it's not technical jargon, but it's jargony because why are you using so many words just for the word provide? And then the other, your central venous catheter twice a week was saline. Okay. So I may not know what a central venous catheter means, but to keep it patent, I definitely have no idea what that is. And I know, of course, what a catheter is. So when it says keep it patent, that has no meaning for me, but keep it clear of obstructions actually does. So it's telling me how to clean this catheter using saline in order to keep it clear of obstructions. Those are the words that have meaning to me. The others, heparin, that means nothing to me. Central venous has no meaning to me at all. But I can get some meaning from it. But the word patent, in my mind, a patent is what you apply for. So it's the other thing you have to consider is that sometimes the jargon that you use, the scientific jargon that you use may have a different meaning in a different field. So now let's do an exercise. So I think Aura sent out a handout to everyone, which will make life a lot easier. But if you don't have it, I will put this up here. And we're going to put you in a room with 2 others. So there'll be 3 in a room. We'll take about 4 or 5 minutes. And all I want you to do is to circle or highlight all of the words in this paragraph that you think the average person would have difficulty understanding. So I don't want to have to bother to have you raise your hand or anything like that. So just whenever you can, just unmute yourself. I'd like you all to tell me what are the words that you think non-experts in this field, which may be many of you actually, what are the words that would cause someone some difficulty understanding this information? I must say, when I got to horse manure, I was a little surprised at what I was reading, but maybe the methane should have given me a clue. So what would be the words or phrases you think people would have difficulty understanding?
I think core substrates, COD analysis, and then there are some, it really depends on the audience because methane, it's pretty known. Kinetics, reaction kinetics, also it's kind of yes or no because they might be known, but these 2 in particular.
Okay, thank you. Any others? It's difficult without having an audience or context for this. I realize that. So I apologize. I think I was thinking, what are the words that I don't understand? So let's think of it as an educated but non-scientific audience.
Yeah,
So
we highlighted a lot of phrases, I think, so like reaction kinetics, anaerobic digestion, percent solids, fixed solids, and volatile solids. Like, I don't know that I could tell you the difference between those 3 groups of solids. COD analysis, I think the other person mentioned. And so more about like, what do these phrases mean in this context?
yes, thank you. That was great. So when I did this, this is what I pulled out, very similar to what you all are saying. Whoop. Well, so notice, methane potential. I know what methane is, but I don't know what they mean by potential. Even though potential is a common word in this context, it had no meaning. And, if you look down, a lot of these are the words that you mentioned. But then for me, potato waste, I don't know what that means. Does that mean rotten potatoes or, I don't know. I don't know is basically what I'm saying. Okay, so if let's say this were a grant proposal and you were someone sitting on the proposal from the city and you were trying to determine whether or not you were going to give money, and you're not necessarily an expert in this field, but you know that this is important because it has to do with wastewater, you certainly would not want that person to have to figure out what this meant. So, all right, so trying whenever possible to express scientific information in common language is very important. So let's look at another situation, and that you'll have a chance to do more exercises. So in addition to jargon and figuring out how do I explain what it is I do to a non-scientific audience, and one way is to define words, to also think about perhaps I'm explaining it to my parent or my brother or my sister who are not members of my particular community. We would call it in tech writing, we call it your discourse community, people who speak the same language as you do. But another issue, in addition to trying to eliminate jargon, is to be concise. And one of the things academia is really good at is helping you use 4 to 5 words when 1 or 2 words will do. And frankly, having dealt with undergraduates, grad students, and some postdocs, it used to come when a teacher would say, I want you to write a 500-word essay, and by God, you would find 500 words to put in that thing, even if they just added no meaning. So one of the ways that I want to move you is from using what we would call nominalization. That is it would be nouns instead of using verbs. So you take perfectly good verbs and turn them into nouns. And again, I want to go back just for a moment into scientific and academic thinking. There tends to be an assumption that if I write and say, we should make a determination, or the lab tech will begin an evaluation, that somehow that information seems to have some objectivity to it, right? That word adds no objectivity whatsoever. All it does is add extra words. So since you're all back and you were all helpful before, let's do this. How would you rewrite, we can just talk through this, all of those without using those ION words or ENCE words or ING words or ILITY words? How would you translate this using verbs? Because verbs are much more energetic and they convey information quickly and directly. So how would we rewrite these?
For the first one, as an example, like we intend
sure.
to, maybe.
Go.
So we intend to instead of our intention is to.
Perfect. Keep going. Come on, folks, we'll get through this.
Right.
I need your help here.
There you go. For number 2, how do we intervene?
Perfect. Okay, the third one.
Should we determine?
Perfect. Next.
The lab tech will evaluate.
I think there's some of you sitting there trying to figure out how to do this because it looks so normal to you. Yes, we'll determine, and the lab tech will evaluate, and we must prevent, or we must, oh, let's see, we must, I don't know how to do this one. We must
How about,
prevent,
how about we must not interfere?
yes, thank you. My brain stopped working. I appreciate that. The committee must decide, what do we assume rather than what assumption do we make? We must collect rather than gather a collection of. We must investigate, etc. Let's have a discussion. No, let's just discuss. So you see, getting to the verb, because this is a form of jargon as well. This is bureaucratic jargon that makes things look more complicated. And notice, as we did this, we decreased the number of words in each of those phrases by sometimes 30% just by using a verb instead of using a noun. So here over on the right, this just reaffirms what you had. And the one my brain stopped working on was let's not interfere. All right, so let's continue. And listen, well, let's stop here. Do any of you have any questions thus far? Even if it isn't about this slide or about being concise, are there any questions anyone has so far?
Yes, I have a question about this because
Sure.
I guess my question is, how do we balance not wanting to appear too aggressive, especially with written text, with also being clear and concise?
And so do you think are you speaking about using verbs as sounding aggressive?
Right, or just more assertive, as opposed to using more nouns that are more passive and less direct?
Well, we're going to actually get to passive voice soon. Amiente, is that your name? Good. I don't know about you, but I need people to be direct when they're giving me information. I need declarative sentences, so you don't have to think back to 5th grade grammar. But I want to know what you're talking about in a quick, easy way that I can immediately understand. And when we load things up, we must prevent an interference, or the committee must make a decision. I personally, professionally, don't think the committee must decide is more aggressive than the committee must make a decision. So that's a very interesting comment, because I've never heard anyone put it in those terms, that by shortening and getting right to the verb and being more direct, that somehow is more aggressive. I don't think that's how people perceive that, at least not in my experience. It doesn't mean that you're ordering somebody to do something. Maybe that's the sense you're getting. But if I say when we begin to investigate, that's not really more aggressive than when we begin the investigation. See? But that's a great question. You're going to make me think about that one after this is over. I really appreciate that. Thank you so much. Any other questions? Or what do you all think about the comment she just made? Do you think it seems more aggressive to just go to the verb?
I was just going to say that in my experience, at least as a graduate student, I find that I use more words if I'm emailing a professor who's like higher ranking than I am, or someone where I'm trying to be like really formal and professional. And then I somehow add all these extra words. So at least, Amiante, when you asked your question, that's what I thought of. But in terms of writing a grant, I don't have that same like feeling of, oh, am I being too aggressive or not?
I think that's a very good distinction. I think, unfortunately, particularly because you're, doctoral candidates or even postdocs, you're still under academic scrutiny. But I will tell you that when you leave academia, people are going to want to know directly and succinctly what it is you're talking about or what your research is. So academic writing does not prepare you to write in the workplace. It prepares you to continue to write in academia. And I used to have this argument with other people in the English department and would say, these engineers that I am teaching how to write a grant proposal, I don't want them to use academic language. You know, isn't going to exist outside of academia unless you continue to publish in academic journals. And now, even if you do, you may have to have those plain language summaries. So you have to think beyond the scope of where you are now. So I do agree, unfortunately, when you write to another professor, you're still proving yourself as an academic or as a professional within academia. Once you leave academia, you can prove what you know sometimes better by using plain language. If you think back to what Einstein said and Feynman and their Neil deGrasse Tyson, I mean, there are tons of scientists who spend a lot of their professional lives making research clear and easy for people to understand. That was a great question. So anyway, let's continue. So let's try this one. So how would we write that first one using just direct plain language, get to the point?
Everyone died.
Yes. All the organisms died.
All the organisms died.
Thank you. That was exactly right. There we go. Oh, and notice again how much shorter it is. Now, getting back to the question we had a minute ago, all the organism died, I suppose, is more direct than the organism exhibited 100% mortality response. But at the same time, oh my gosh, I just want to know what happened. I just want to know what happened. So how about in the next one? What are the words in the next one that we might not need? So is there a way to, instead of my physician and such associates, technical assistants and other healthcare providers, is there a way to make that simpler?
Medical team.
Yeah.
Great. That would be great. The medical team. And then when it says which are advisable to perform such procedures, which are advisable in their professional judgment, would you expect anything less? Therefore, why would that need to be stated? So what if instead we just did this? Oop, excuse me. I authorize my physician and other healthcare providers to perform necessary procedures. Right? Easy, quick. Okay, one more. So in this case, it's exercise 2. So if you go back into your rooms, and I think maybe we need to give people about 5 minutes or so to do, 5 or 6 minutes. Let's say 6 minutes to do this. This was actually one paragraph, and I pulled it apart and numbered the sentences. It would not have appeared this way, but I also bolded those pieces of information that I think are that language that could be eliminated. So let's see if you can come up with a rewrite of this, getting rid of everything that is unimportant, but you have to maintain meaning. That's the tricky part. You can't take something out that is necessary just because. So let's see if you could rewrite it. You can just rewrite it sentence by sentence the way the original. But let's go back into your rooms. Let's say maybe 6 minutes and see what we can come up with. So why don't we do what we did before? I apologize for not putting the number of words with each sentence, but the total was 138 words. So how would you rewrite that first sentence? And there was nothing in here that I think people would have difficulty understanding. It's just a function of what I call overwriting, right? It's just too many words to get to the point. So would somebody like to just tell us how they rewrote that first sentence. Or what were the considerations what did you consider? I almost said considerations you made, but that would violate what I just said a while ago. What did you consider as you were rewriting?
So our group said we rewrote it as to use an independent t-test. We assume that all samples are random, have the same variance, and fit a normal distribution.
That was great. That was great. Mine was to use an independent t-test. We must assume the samples are random, similar in variance, and normally distributed. So essentially the same thing you did. So that was great. If you did what I did, obviously, that's great. So there we go. How about sentence? No skepticism. How about sentence 2? It's really helpful when you can hear how somebody else handled the language and see if you handle it in a similar way. So does somebody want to give me 2?
The first assumption is that someone or something has an equal chance to be in either group to avoid bias.
Okay. So let me say something about this. I appreciate that because I think that was good. When I didn't think of it at the time, but so I'm going to talk you through something you're not actually going to see, which is a little difficult. But how the number 1 should have been set up is that we must make 3, or we assume 3, I'm just going to say elements. 1, that the samples are random. 2, that the variance, well, what did it say? They're random, they're similar in variance, and they're normally distributed. So sentences 2, 3, and 4 and 5 are actually part of those assumptions. So had I thought about it this way, what I would have done is use that first opening to use an independent t-test. And then I would have said the 3 things we're assuming. And then number 1 would have been underneath that sentence. So remember, I was talking about formatting. So you have 3 assumptions. Here they are. So if you've numbered it, you don't need to say the first assumption because the number 1 says that. Number 2 would then say the second assumption, and they are in order as they were given in the sentence. So like I said, one of the things about writing that I'm sure you know, because when you write a dissertation, you rewrite multiple times, at least I did, is that when you come back to it, you see it differently. So now I'm seeing all of this language differently than I did when I originally put it up there. So kind of for the sake of time, let me just show you these sentences. So there are, I'm sure that we could disagree on the specifics of the words that we're using, because no 2 writers will ever agree on how something should be written. But the way that I did it, and as I said, looking back on it, number 2 would have been the first, number 1 is an assumption, and the sentence 1 would have just been kind of an introduction. And then it would have been 1, 2, and then I think that, excuse me, my little fingers on that touchpad. But this is the way I rewrote them, and we cut the wording almost in half. Now, does this sound more direct? Yes, it does. But at the same time, you're getting the reader the information that they need or want quickly, and their reading time is cut in half because you only have half the number of words here, and you didn't essentially have to define anything. because the language itself, the words, obviously, I think people understand what random means. I don't think you'd have to explain random, but they decided in the original to do that. All right, so let's move on. So this one's really more by way of fun. So this is how an academic, myself included, because I used to be one. So does anybody have any idea what this sentence actually says? Okay, I can only torture you for so long and then, then I have to stop. So this is what that means. Now, I might use the first one to write to my professor if I was still trying to impress her on my ability to be, a bit obtuse. But if I'm writing a grant proposal or I'm applying for a job and I want to explain my research to the symphony, the second one is what I want to say, right? And let's look at the next. And let's say in this situation, this sentence was to be used in a book that would, an article that would definitely be read by the public, like let's say Nature magazine, for example. So anyone have any idea what those three things are at the end of the sentence?
Maybe types of birds.
Yeah, they look like species names.
Yes, very good. Very good. You were able to translate Latin into English. So this is what this one says. We compared size, method for finding food, and rates of digestion for 3 kinds of birds. And notice they say 3 kinds of birds and then they number them. Just so that, because if you sometimes people don't see the word 3, it just adds a little more symbolic reference to the words that you're using. The first one is perfect for an academic audience. The second one is perfect for, as I said, Nature magazine, something to that effect. All right, so once you've identified the jargon, whether it's scientific or whether it's really just overwriting, and you have to decide whether or not those terms are actually relevant for the audience that you're writing for. And obviously from all these examples, if it's not necessary, don't do it. So as I mentioned, one technique is to put a name to your audience. Who am I writing for? Would my mother, my father, my parent, my sister, my sibling, my spouse, my best friend who's an English professor understand what my research is about? So let's try this. So here are more words that are appropriate within particular field. Let's see if you can determine what these words are without Googling them. What would be the more common or simpler way of expressing the same information?
Chemotherapy.
Okay, and the first one? Okay. Anybody have any? That one really annoyed me. I mean,
Anti-cancer
really
agent.
annoyed me because all that means, chemotherapeutic agent, just means a drug. That really annoyed me. I mean, come on. All right, so how about hypo and hypertension?
Low and high blood pressure.
Right, low, that's exactly right. And lesion?
A cut.
That's injury.
Right. So, again, that doctor that told me I was going to become obtunded, maybe the person sitting in front of you doesn't know what a lesion is. I used to think a lesion meant sewing things together, bringing them together rather than pulling them apart. So maybe if you'd taken Latin, you might know. Angina.
That's chest pain, right?
Yeah, chest pain or heart pain, right, exactly. And gastroesophageal reflux disease,
Heartburn.
good. And cellulitis,
Wouldn't that just be cellulitis?
well, I don't know, is cellulitis a disease? It actually literally just means under the skin.
Yeah.
It's an inflammation of the
Right.
cells.
And edema,
Blood clot.
no.
Swelling.
I mean, it
Swelling?
might be used that way.
Or like a bruise?
It means swelling. I didn't know that. I mean, not that I knew the rest, but I certainly got that one wrong. And the next one, comminuted fracture.
Is that some kind of bone fracture?
Yeah, it would be a shattered bone, not just broken, but shattered. We don't want to hear we don't want this coming out of our doctor's mouth. An acute myocardial infarction.
Heart attack.
Heart attack.
Right, just a heart attack. Right. So again, given your audience, why would you use any of those words when the common words are things that we do all understand? So let me move ahead to, we've got just a bit of time left. I'm going to skip this one, but I would suggest when you get the slides, you might want to take a look at it because this is a rather well done. All right, well, we'll take a couple minutes with this. So notice this was used within a grant proposal. And here was the original information that was being given in the grant proposal. This is a study of aging. It's ongoing. The results had to do with correlations between aging and blood glucose levels, and the results supported a particular hypothesis. And then the revision that was made to make the grant clearer to the committee, notice that they, as with the original, they used the word we. My touchpad is so sensitive. They used the word we. They started out in the same manner that the original did. And then they started to just simply use plain language, number of taste buds, and then in paren, give the reader the scientific name or the Latinate pupillae, the Latinate version. Markers of low blood glucose, that's sugar, levels after patient fasts for 8 hours. So I had to look up fasting blood glucose levels because I didn't know your glucose could fast, because that's what it sounded like to me. But in any case, then talked about when the BLSA was established, and then what the conclusion was. Here's what we found, and these results support the study of how blood sugar affects the aging process. And notice that they broke it into 3 shorter paragraphs. Some of the sentences are a little long, longer than I had suggested to you earlier, but the one in the middle, by putting that and letting it stand alone, it gives it more notice because you have white space around it. And that tells you what the purpose of the study is, the observational study of normal aging in community volunteers. Okay, so exercise 3. I think we only need we just need a few minutes for this one. So, you know what, I'm gonna just go through this myself because we're 15 minutes out from the end, and I want to get to active voice because that came up earlier in conversation, and I think that's particularly important. So if anybody would like to just say what they think that first sentence meant.
Like river birds.
Okay, go ahead.
I like river birds.
River birds. I just said river birds make me happy. I mean, why not? Or what is, she was involuntarily domiciled.
She was homeless.
Yes. And the patient was given positive pressure, etc.
Was put on a ventilator.
Very good. And then the last one.
Time and location or time and space?
Time and space. That's the key. Also, I put this in the active voice. The researcher investigated time and space. That's a really important investigation because it's an investigation of everything. All right, so this came up earlier, and I appreciate the young woman who brought this up, but the issue of using the active voice. So I'm going to explain, you may already know the difference between the two, but I used to just assume everyone did until I discovered that in fact they didn't. And so you'll recognize it, but you may not have particularly noticed it. So in the active voice, we always know who is doing the action, who is responsible. So the director sent the report, the foundation responded. So there's no denying who has responsibility. So even if we were saying the researchers in lab room 12, et cetera. So who does what? Who does what? The passive voice tends to be the one, again, that in academia, students are taught that this is more objective because we don't have a human element in it. However, it's not true, but secondarily, we often put the person responsible at the end of the sentence, which means then we're truly not trying to hide who is responsible. So if you say the report was sent to the foundation, that's in the passive voice. It's also in the passive voice if you put by the director at the end. However, if you've identified who the agent is, then there definitely is no reason not to use the active voice. You should definitely be using the active voice. The only times I think that the passive voice is appropriate is when you don't want to, when you only want to emphasize the action, and therefore you're not going to name. So the research was completed January 12th. I may not need to know who completed it. What I may need to know is just that it was completed. But if I say the research study was completed January 12th by the research team, well, then I could have just said the research team completed the research because I've already indicated it. You also want to use the active voice when you don't want to sound accusatory. So in a lot of situations, you don't want to say, someone made an error to a group of people because now you're accusing everyone standing in front of you. Whereas if you say an error was made in last year's budget, then the focus is on the error. And then however we find out who did it, we will do that. The active voice, children learn to speak in the active voice. It's more energetic, it's more forceful, it's more human, it's more sincere, it's less wordy, it's easier to read, to understand, to remember, and it's more conversational. And actually, outside of academia in particular, it can sound much more professional and not so bureaucratic. The passive voice, as I said, often makes it hard for us to know who did what, but maybe that's the point. It's generally wordier, and we often have to think about who is doing what, and it is not more objective. That's just one of those myths that we carry around, that if somehow I put it in the passive voice, then there's objectivity to whatever it is that I'm saying. So let's take a look at some that we could do together. So how would we turn this into the active voice?
Monkeys really love bananas. Scientists have conducted many experiments based on that fact, something along those lines.
Great. That's great, Dennis. Perfect. All right, let's do the next one. So that's what I did. How about this one?
Scientists recommend drinking coffee because it's more concentrated. There's too many clauses, sorry.
That's okay. So here we have nouns. So many scientists recommend drinking coffee because it gives you more energy and you can concentrate better. Right? Something like that. That may not even be what I have written when I show you how I rewrote it, but that energetic also gets into a noun when it can just say energy. And then the last one.
So something like drink 2.5 to 3 liters of water to have a healthier body, keep your digestive system working better, and make your skin more beautiful.
Oh, that's great. I read that as slightly different, but I can see, because I think the punctuation is not particularly, there's a punctuation problem, but that's great. So here's my rewrite. I think yours was actually better than mine. So again, two writers are not going to come up with the same revision, but I think obviously you have the point. So let's do this. Let's do our last exercise. Let's put everyone, I don't think we're going to have time. All right. I'll just show you. Okay. I'll make this easy for everybody. So in this case, the passive equivalent would be, and in the second one, the active equivalent would be, and in the third one, sometimes we don't know. And so we may have to leave it that way if we don't know who proposed it. But in this case, I just decided it was the EPA, right? Or in number 4, set of instructions. When you give instructions to people, you really do want to be direct. And so in this case, we just tell people to include the information in your application. And then finally, here again, I use the pronoun we. We often have these situations, and we make sure that we ensure discipline. We probably don't even need to say are taking measures too, right? We're just going to ensure discipline. Okay, 2 more slides, and then if you all have any other questions. So I talked just a little bit about the intent of formatting and design and how that can help you. This has nothing to do with science. This has to do with a report that's sent to the Securities Exchange Commission by all public companies once a year. It's called a 10K. And in that report, they have to talk about how people are compensated. So if I were to give you this report and it looked like the one on the left, it would look like something that maybe somebody had produced in an academic environment, although it was using headings, which are very appreciated and are very helpful. But it doesn't exactly draw me into the reading. But what if it had been rewritten like this? And I don't want you to try to read it. The issue isn't the reading of it. The issue is the formatting of it, by breaking it into columns, by putting boxes around certain pieces of information, by creating a table, by using headings that are easy to see and read. you give the reader a sense that, oh, I'm going to be able to understand this, instead of long drawn out, packed together, dense paragraphs and sentences. This looks more like a snack or a bite rather than a full meal of text, which is what the one on the left. And so I show this to you only as a way to say, again, once you leave academia and you are writing to all the audiences that you described at the beginning of this workshop, this is something that will pull them into reading, whereas the other, frankly, made me feel, and some of the people I had shown it to made us feel like we were back at university. So visual presentation can be quite important. And so here are several additional resources, regardless of what field you're in. You know, something from one from Britain, but nevertheless, having to do with medical information. There's a great book, Writing Science in Plain English by Anne Green. The government itself has a plain language group within the government so that agencies are writing in plain language. I don't think the agencies are doing a particularly good job, but they're supposed to be. Science blogs on how to report scientific research. So this is here for you to use in any way that might be helpful. So I think we've reached the end of our workshop. If you have any questions, we have a couple of minutes. I'd be more than happy to answer them.
I have a quick question about your formatting slide. So the slide that was before, what are your thoughts on using things like bold and italics and stuff like that? I mean, do you use them judiciously and even color? What are your thoughts on using that to set stuff apart?
Yeah, I think yes, but I think you use only one means of emphasis. So in other words, I would not italic, underline and bold something. Well, I wouldn't underline anything anymore because that just, now we all think anything underlined is a link. So I think definitely you could use bold, definitely you could use italics, you can use it for headings, or you can use it within the context itself if you want to emphasize something in particular. So for instance, if you have a one sentence conclusion that's you know, a new result of something, you could put the whole sentence in italics. So I think that's important to help the reader know that this part is important. And I love to use color, but I only use it maybe for a title, or if I want to separate information into chunks, I might put a line between it, depending on what I'm writing.
Okay, thank you.
Uh-huh.
All right.
I have a question with the on the slide where you had the number of sentences, paragraphs, headings, and visuals. There were 1 to 2 visuals per page. One thing I was always advised was if you're going to have a graphic, always have a narrative with it or some explanatory. Okay.
Absolutely agree with you. For one thing, people absorb information in different ways. So if I'm a visual learner, the table will speak to me, but if I'm a verbal learner, the words will speak to me. And so you should always explain what you want the audience to know from looking at that visual. So thank you very much. That's a very good point. Very important. It does not stand by itself, right? Can't stand there by itself. Anything else? Well, I want to thank you all. I am so happy that I had this opportunity to revisit my, I guess not my alum. I mean, I'm not an alumni, but I certainly spent 25 years at UNC Charlotte and liked most of it, as with anything else we do. And I really think helping you learn how to write for the public is extremely important. And so it really feeds my passion to be able to be here with you today. And if at any time any of you want, have any other questions, please feel free to email me. I'm more than happy to interact with you on a one-on-one basis, just to give you a little feedback or, kind of help you think through something. So thank you so much.